Hello, everyone. Um, as some of you know, the Gotham Writers Workshop has been putting on an online webinar series called Inside Writing with different topics each time. And the topic for this webinar today is diversity in publishing. And I'm the moderator. My name is Rosalie Morales Kearns. I'm a fiction writer. I have a novel and a short story collection published by very small presses. And I'm the founder of another very small press called Shade Mountain Press. And before I introduce the panelists, just a little housekeeping stuff. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You might have to hover your cursor over it to see that. But you can type up a question using that button at any time during the discussion. And then about halfway through or so, I'll take a look at the questions and start picking some of them for us to discuss, for the panelists to talk about. So let me introduce our panelists, Samantha Fabien and Kirsten Imani Kasai, sorry. Samantha is a literary agent at Laura Dale Literary Agency, where she's seeking manuscripts that feature marginalized or underrepresented perspectives and own voices. I was really glad to see that description in your listing, Samantha. And Kirsten is a novelist who also teaches creative writing, including at the Gotham Writers Workshop. Her first two novels, Ice Song and Tattoo, were published by Random House. Her third novel was published by my own press. The novel is The House of Ersley, published in 2018. This novel was an editor's choice at Historical Novels Review, and critics have described it in various terms, including spellbinding, fascinating and surreal, propulsive, compelling, provocative and enlightening, and blurring the edges between dream and reality. Kirsten's favorite quote from reviewers is, "Kirsten Imani Kasai makes the macabre beautiful," which is quite a compliment, and not that easy to say, actually, macabre beautiful. So before I turn it over to our panelists, just a couple of points I'm gonna make. And so the topic is diversity in publishing, but I'll just say the lack of diversity in publishing is an issue in all kinds of ways. And since we only have an hour and we have two panelists and people who might want to ask questions, as the moderator, I'm going to focus on the underrepresentation of writers of color, particularly Black writers. But panelists and questioners, please feel free to bring up any other aspect of any underrepresented identities, including queer writers, disabled writers, writers from working class backgrounds, and so forth. And before we start, I'd like to just start off with some statistics and a quote, and then we can maybe keep those in mind while we're talking to each other. So the statistics, according to a survey by Publishers Weekly, the publishing industry is 84% white. Lee and Low, the children's publisher Lee and Low, also does a yearly diversity survey, and their 2019 survey brought that number in at 76%. So obviously they're questioning slightly different respondents in those surveys. So one says 84%, one says 76%. What I thought particularly interesting is that Lee and Low recently they tweeted about the Black representation in the publishing industry. They broke it down out of the data they had from their baseline survey. So the percentage of Black people in these various subcategories are as follows in publishing. So 5% of authors are Black, 4% of literary agents, 1% of editorial staff, 4% of marketing and publicity staff, 3% of sales staff, and 4% of reviewers. So that's the Black representation exactly in the publishing industry per this particular survey. And so those are the statistics. Now here's the quote. It's not an exact quote, but it's something I have been hearing as a writer for decades in all kinds of venues, like at writing conferences, panels with editors and agents and so forth, and writing advice in writing magazines and so forth. And the advice is basically, it's for writers who are sending out their short stories to journals and writers who are sending out their novels to literary agents. And the advice is, all that matters is the quality of the writing. So if it's good enough, it's going to get published. It'll find the right journal editor, it'll find the right literary agent, etc. So that's what I wanted to start with, those statistics about representation in the industry, and that idea that we have been told many times is that the quality of the writing is all that matters, that you'll get published if the writing is good enough. So let me turn it over to the panelists, basically with an opening question of tell us some more about your own journeys. Kirsten and Samantha, should we start with you, Kirsten? Is that okay? Basically, tell us about your own journey as a writer, seeking a literary agent, getting published by the large presses, the big five publishers, and so forth, and then ending up published with a small press and so forth.
So I had been publishing and writing and publishing just sort of off around the edges of my life for a number of years, because I was working full time and raising children. And when I finished my first book and started sending it out, I got a lot of the typical responses that were so interesting, so good, so beautiful, but not for me, or I didn't love it. And I've come to realize that the I didn't love it is shorthand for I can't relate to it. Not across the board, but I think it's used conveniently as a way to say no to something without having to explain why. But I did find an agent for my first two novels, and those were speculative fiction. Those were sold to Random House, which was really exciting to get in at one of the big five as a debut writer. So that was hugely exciting and important. And it was just kind of interesting to see how that process happened. And once I went through all of that, and kind of had my foray into professional traditional publishing, I kind of lost motivation for a while and became very dismayed by the experience of publishing. And I don't remember who said it, but I know that there is a quote that many writers have had their hearts broken by publishing, which I think is a really important separate issue that we can talk about, because you go into a job unprepared, right? You're hired to do a job, which is sell your books, market them, be a professional writer, but there's no training or preparation in the same way that there would be with other jobs. So you kind of go into it blindly, and you don't have a wide view on all of the issues and how to navigate the many different challenges that there are, both positive and negative. So those two books went well, and then I kind of had a setback creatively after that experience. And I went to get my MFA at Antioch, which restored me tremendously. And to Antioch, I brought The House of Rosalie, which was still in its early stages. And I was very determined to write about my experience, the mixed experience, through this historical lens, which I felt had been addressed in some ways. I think one of the main books that is shared in school in terms of the mixed experience is always Nella Larson's Passing, which is a wonderful book, but not necessarily relevant so much to the contemporary experience when, you know, social mores and cultural mores and people's experiences have changed so much. So it was really important to me to write about the mixed experience. And I wrote The House of Rosalie, and when it came time to start looking for a publisher, I was very clear that I wanted someone who would see me and see the work that I had done and understand it in context, historically, culturally, in terms of how to represent it to the world. And so I specifically was looking for a woman, person of color, queer. This is like my umbrella for trying to move ahead to the right place in my career now. And in those searches for feminist publishers who specialize in women's works and underrepresented voices, I found Shade Mountain, and I sent it to Rosalie, and the experience was very different. It was personal. It was really in depth. We worked together. It was like a partnership. I mean, it was kind of a dream. And so having had both those experiences gave me a better sense of what the possibilities are in publishing and how to move forward. So that is my long-winded answer.
No, it's not long-winded at all. It's very interesting. And I want to talk about some of those points later in the discussion, but let's hear from Samantha. Do you want to talk about your journey becoming an agent and what that's like, what that entails?
Sure. So I kind of fell into the publishing industry accidentally. And I think a lot of people have a similar story, or they knew from the very beginning. For me, I really went to college with the vision to be a journalist. I felt like that was the way to kind of marry my love of literature and writing in a way that would give me like professional success. It wasn't until my senior year of college that I actually realized like I'd been reading my entire life. It was such an intricate part of me, but I never considered it as an industry in which I could pursue. So that senior year is when I kind of learned more about it, and I heard about the Columbia publishing course. So that was the first step that I took into understanding the publishing landscape, because at that point, all I knew about were editors. I wasn't really too clear on what other departments existed and how to begin entry into those positions. So for those who aren't familiar, the Columbia publishing course is a 6-week intensive publishing course that kind of has panels and workshops set up in place so you can learn about the publishing industry firsthand. So being able to see professionals who worked in editorial at big houses, editorial at smaller presses, being able to see foreign rights departments, managing editors, production, and learning about the ins and outs of their day-to-day really helped me kind of see where I saw myself. So literary agents were probably the ones that I connected with the most. My boss always says that literary agents are people who love to start things, and editors are the ones who love to end things. And I know that I'm someone who loves to start a lot of projects. I'm usually very enthusiastic, but not always perfect on the tail end when we're kind of wrapping the things up. So after Columbia, I realized that I wanted to pursue agenting. So I interned at 3 different agencies. I interned at Aisha Pandey Literary, which is a small literary agency with a wonderful team whom I love. And I had so many amazing mentors there. And then I went on to Writers House. Writers House, as you know, is a fairly large literary agency, so it was great to kind of see the differences in the way that the operations went. And at Writers House, I primarily concentrated on foreign rights, which was really where I got to experience that side of the business, which hadn't been discussed to the same level in my other experience. Following that, I worked part-time at Chalberg and Sussman, which is another smaller literary agency, before starting at Laura Dale Literary, where I am now. So my journey kind of leading into Laura Dale was about 3 years long. And then I got my job at Laura Dale, where I started off as a foreign rights manager and then became a literary agent the following year. So now I've been an agent for a year and a foreign rights manager for 2 years, and I still do both.
Great, great. Well, what do you, I'll give this question to Samantha first, and then to Kirsten. I know your journey has been shorter. You're younger. You have so fewer years to look back on. But is there something you wish you knew before you started that you now know? Anything you would, or maybe a different way of putting that is what do you think someone just coming in to the type of work you're doing, what do you wish they knew? What would you like to tell them?
That's a really great question. I actually regularly try to reflect on what's something I wish I knew. I think that just knowing that your passion is something that you have to hold on to, because I've always been a reader. I've always loved reading, and especially when you're factoring into diversity and the lots of conversations that are going on, and how a lot of those conversations kind of also get hit with kind of devastating statistics. I think holding on to your passion and the reason why you're pursuing this career is very important. It can be kind of discouraging and hard, especially as a publishing professional, to see that there's only 4% of literary agents that are Black. But I remember that even when I wasn't seeing myself in books, they still changed my life and they still meant so much to me. So I have the unique opportunity to shepherd stories where I actually see more of myself, and I can get to those readers who may say like, oh, I'm not a fan of reading, but just because they haven't seen themselves yet. I think that there's a book for everyone, and being able to be a part of shepherding that book to someone and putting it in the right hands, that passion has to be what fuels you despite what other things are going on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a very good way to put it. What about you, Kirsten? Things you wish you knew way back?
Oh gosh. I think the most important one that would have made the most difference to me in this journey would have been to understand the power of my own voice and understand that I had a right to share my stories. Because again, when you don't see yourself represented anywhere, you feel like no one is listening or that you don't exist. And this is coming from, I'm older. And so my experience has been watching all of these big shifts happen over the decades. And had I known at the beginning, like, yeah, you have a right to share your story and get your voice out there just as much as anyone else. Like, to understand that the voice of a young person of color is equal to the voice of a white man, a white heterosexual man, which is the template against which everything else is measured, that is huge. And that goes a long way. And I think once people can start to have that faith in themselves, that I deserve to be heard, I have a place at the table, that goes a long way to giving you the confidence to keep that passion alive, because the passion is really what's driving you.
That's a great point. That's a great point. I wanted to bring up some of the some other topics that have sort of been making news, or at least making Twitter recently, and maybe get your takes on them, and maybe if people want to put in some questions about that too. So one of them is the publishing paid me situation, where a couple of weeks ago, some more established writers, I don't even know who exactly started it, but started sharing, and this was so important, I thought, started sharing what exactly they were getting paid in their advances, and what exactly they made, how much money they made over the life of a book, and so forth. And people were so white authors were sharing this information, authors of color were sharing this information. So it quickly became clear that like you say about the white straight man being the template, white authors often were getting not just more, but like a lot more, earning a lot more than authors of color, including ones that were award winners and had really high profiles, and obviously already a national reputation as being great writers. So did anyone want to chime in on that, or share your thoughts on that?
I mean, I'm happy to kind of take take the lead there. So yeah, I saw when publishing paid me kind of took over Twitter, and I believe it was started by LL McKinney, an author, YA author.
Yes.
And so she kind of opened up this opportunity for transparency, which I think is very important, because without information, there's no way to kind of advocate for yourself. As a literary agent, though, I do have to look at the numbers, and I did. And unfortunately, they do lack context. I think the disparity is 100% there. I think that white cis men, heterosexual, were paid, you know, marginally more than anyone who identified as queer and a person of color, especially females or female identifying authors. And so that was a real shock. I think the team, like my team in particular, we had a really important discussion about that information and how context really would help frame it in terms of like how much each publisher was paying, what year those books came out, what the rights were for, whether it was World English or world rights, whether audio was retained, or, you know, what rights were kind of retained in that sense, and then their track record, sales record, things like that. But I think that the disparity, was very clear when you looked at like N.K. Jemisin, who has such a, like, you know, storied history and such amazing awards to her name, and then to see that she's paid so much less than someone who had like a debut, you know, kind of getting six figures right out of the gate. So I think I'm glad that there was this transparency in this conversation that's opened, but it also feels like it's just the beginning. We need to consider the context, and we need to consider you know, the conversations that are happening on the publisher side and how they're really factoring into making these investments. Is it truly, you know, a manner of what's selling and what's working, or is it kind of something that they're perpetuating? I think it was heard that, you know, CEOs were saying that Black kids don't read, or Black people don't read. And I found that personally offensive. And I think that the 5% of Black people in the publishing industry found that offensive, because even though we never saw ourselves, we still managed to get here. And so we can only imagine how many more people would work in the industry if they could see themselves, right? So I think it's an important conversation, but I am on the business side, so I do have to consider context. Yeah. And I'm pretty sure, you know, N.K. Jemisin her royalties are probably stupendous. I can't say that the white man is receiving those same, you know, royalties. And I think that's, yeah.
Well, weren't they also sharing that, like, this is how much I earned total? So not just advance, but this is what I earned from this book. I don't remember.
I think I only saw advances were announced, like that initial investment.
Okay.
I think that the royalties are a little bit trickier, because then you have to kind of admit how many copies you actually sold, if you ever earned out. And, you know, all of those like nitty-gritty details. And I think everyone was just kind of following a system of like, this is how much money I had up front. But I think that it was still an important thing to see those figures side by side.
Well, and does it make you, or is there some advice you'd like to give to writers who are, in fact, they've written something, writers of color or writers from other underrepresented groups who have written something that really has a lot of commercial potential. Not necessarily literary fiction. That's harder to estimate or predict or whatever. But other types. Do you think they should? Is that something they should know about? They should bear in mind while they're trying to find someone like an agent who's going to represent them as best as possible?
I mean, I think that the numbers are important, but it's kind of hard to use them as a framework, I think, in the writer context.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of things to factor into, like in terms of like right now, we're probably going to come out of, the pandemic with some kind of economic depression. So just factoring things like that. But I think that's where the agent kind of comes in and can really, keep in mind what seems reasonable and negotiate for the best opportunity and the best deal. I know that there were also authors who were unagented, who were in the publishing paid me hashtag. And I think that it can be tricky because obviously as an agent, I'm kind of equipped to know like what's a reasonable ask and negotiate a little bit further and make sure that, okay, maybe the advance isn't where we want it, but we're retaining the rights that we can exploit in other ways like audio and etc. So I think it's important to, comb through the information for your own sanity, but also don't become too laser focused on those numbers because there's a lot of different factors not considered.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you. Kirsten, did you want to weigh in on that or?
Yeah, thank you, Samantha, for bringing up all of those different important points. I mean, I don't think a lot of authors at the beginning understand the vagaries of that calculation, getting in the different rights and weighing, we hear a lot about, establishing your platform and the kind of work that you're doing, the kind of fiction. Is it something that's hot right now? There's so many different things that go into that. And I think, in my experience and the experience of a lot of other writers I've talked to, you go into it kind of starry-eyed and you're like $1 million, I'm gonna get $1 million somewhere. And because you hear about those, and it's this like glorious dream that we all strive for. And the reality is much different. And there are significant disparities between people of color and white people who are publishing, and the othering that happens kind of pushes everyone off to the side. Again, it's that template of what is, the standard. And so when you're looking to that template of the standard, not understanding all of the other factors that go in, it can be really disappointing. It can be confusing. People don't understand, because we don't have the information. Like Samantha, you were talking about the need for transparency, and I 100% agree, because authors don't have that transparency. So it's really hard to know, like when you're negotiating for your book, if you are unagented, what's reasonable? What's like, what am I doing here? So I think having that transparency is really helpful, and just an understanding of the actual process of getting a book to print is really important. And yeah, as you mentioned, we're going into a recession. We are in a recession. 2008, when that happened, that shook up publishing hugely and affected a lot of the decisions that were being made for publishers and authors and so forth. So there's a lot to consider. I think that just the discussion that's happening now is so timely and so needed. So I'm really happy to see that people are at least talking about it and sharing, because, there is this kind of secrecy tied to money, how much we make. And the job market is one where you're out auctioning yourself off and you don't even know for how much. Well, what would you like to be paid? It's kind of the thing. So we don't know.
Yes.
So I think it's really good that there's more discussion between publishers and agents and authors, so that we can all work together to achieve our goals, because we all have the same aim, right? Which is to produce a successful book.
Good, thank you.
I agree.
Go ahead, Samantha.
No, I was just going to say that I agree with, everything you said, and the transparency is very, very important. So I think that the conversations that are continuing. I just want to make sure, I hope that they continue and that we don't kind of get amnesia about any of this, so that we can get the progress that we want.
Right, yeah.
Well, I'm going to start looking at some of the questions, but I just wanted to also raise another point related to agents and related to what Kirsten was saying about hearing agents say, I didn't relate to this, and so forth. And it was something I saw that an agent posted, and it was shared on social media, and now I can't find it again. So I don't know who the person was. But what was really interesting to me is that she seemed to have just sort of had like a moment of inspiration or a paradigm shift or whatever that was really, really hopeful to me anyway. And she said that she was going to stop just reacting to manuscripts based on I resonated with that, or I identified with that, and so forth. And she said she was going to, so instead of, because she's a white woman, and she said, instead, I'm going to ask myself, besides the fact whether it's a well-written manuscript, but then go on to, is this saying something important? Is a voice that needs to be heard, and so forth, even if I don't have the cultural competency, let's say, to appreciate it. And it kind of relates to something I wrote about in my essay in Entropy Magazine, Floorboards and Gatekeepers, when I was talking about why I related so much to Kirsten's book, and because it did resonate with me on so many different levels, and in terms of things that I'm interested in and that I like to read about, including Afro-Caribbean spirituality and African-American history, and things like that. But yet, it shouldn't necessarily have to depend on like one person with all those particular interests. I would like to think that others who didn't necessarily have those personal interests could at least see, wow, this is beautifully written, it's intriguing, it's different, it's something that needs to be heard, and that can only happen, I think, well, in two ways. There should be certainly more than 4% Black agents, and however many percentage that is for Latinx and other groups, and also those agents or editors, acquiring editors who are members of overrepresented groups should just stop asking themselves like, oh, I didn't resonate, I can't relate, next. Those are the two things that I would hope would be happening, and maybe that will happen, as more agents have that kind of moment that this particular agent had.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's kind of tricky when I see people discussing like the agent replies, because I think that saying, you don't connect with the voice is obviously very difficult for a writer to receive, especially a marginalized writer, because you're like, just because you don't connect with it doesn't mean it's not valid.
Yeah.
Right. But I also I think that sometimes we get in this bad pattern where, the sheer volume that agents get can kind of put you into a space where it's really difficult to reply with care in every case that you want to. But I think we're all, because of the conversations that have happened, at least the friends that I've spoken to, I think we're all taking a lot more care when we respond to things, and giving some feedback that could be helpful and constructive, rather than saying like, oh, I don't connect with this and I can't relate, because I think those aren't really justifications. I think it's all about the storytelling, and if the message is important, as you said, there are plenty of stories that I don't identify with, but I can see their value, and I can see how there's someone waiting to be enriched with this story. So I think that this is something that we are discussing a little bit more, especially with agents, and I think that I hope the same is going on with editors, and that they're not just sticking into very particular comfort zone acquisitions. I do know that I kind of have taken it upon myself to do as much as I can. It can be a lot, as I said, like I think right now from June, I have like 250 queries. So that can be kind of intimidating to think about going through and answering every single one with care. But I think just the effort and the consideration that there's a person on the other end, and you know, you don't know what number rejection this is or pass or what stage they are in their career, and how important it is to really think about the meaning and the importance of the story, and like what you need to take and glean from it in terms of moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I worked as an editor in multiple capacities, but I was a magazine editor for 7 years, and then I was the editor and publisher in my own small magazine. And so I get that I didn't love it, because if I only published stories that I had loved, we wouldn't have been able to put out every single issue that we did, right? But the question then is it well written? Does it address all the points? You know, is it meaningful to somebody? Is this an essential piece? And then making the decision based on that, not just does it personally resonate with me? Because there have only been a handful of pieces, you know, that I just loved, right? That I talk about, that I tell other people about, that I remember, but that doesn't negate all of the other amazing work that I have selected and published, because it was good. It was good. And it is a tricky balance. I mean, it's looking for that like elusive dream, right? Of the perfect one.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm looking at some of the questions, so bear with me because it's the type is really small, and and there's some very good questions. Some of them are quite long. One, maybe I can answer this one. When you talked about the percentage of Black persons in publishing, do you include Latinos and all races? And somebody else was asking also about that survey. And you can look at the Lee and Low website and find that information. They do break things up by racial or ethnic identification, gender identification, abledness, and other factors. So you would see that on their website, Lee and Low, Lee, and Low, Low. It should be pretty easy to find. It's really interesting stuff. And let's see. Okay, this is kind of an interesting question. Can white authors write in a Black voice or from a Black or mixed point of view? And can is, I don't know whether can meaning are they able to, or should they, or what, but would someone like to address that about a white author writing in the voice of a character, let's say, of color?
Well, that is a valid question. It's one that gets asked a lot.
That's why I picked it.
You know, because I teach creative writing, I encounter this quite a bit. And always it goes back to the line between appreciation and appropriation. And are you perpetrating a stereotype? And do you know what you're doing? And so I think that when I run into this in my teaching, I encourage people to really educate yourself about what it is that you're trying to do. What role does the character serve? You know, how is their voice relevant? Like, are you reaching for that most stereotypical voice that you've heard, you know, in the media because that's the only one that you're familiar with? That's how you think everybody talks? Or are you doing it for a genuine reason? I mean, you have to educate yourself before you can take this step, because to do so carelessly or thoughtlessly is thoughtless. It's disingenuous, and you're taking away somebody else's voice when you do that. But yeah, just understand what othering is and what that means, and learn how to write respectfully.
Yeah, I think you kind of put it perfectly. I think that there needs to be a lot of care and thought in it. Personally, I think that I prefer people of color to write their own authentic experience, which is why I often look for own voices. I think there's a nuance that can't always be captured if it's not true to your own experience in some cases. And also there's a kaleidoscope of experiences, right? So it can never just be one story and then that kind of marginalization is covered. There's always so many different layers to pack there. I think that stories should be, you know, very similar to your dinner table, as someone once put it. You know, if your community is diverse, then those side characters, those people featured should be seamlessly diverse, just as much. You don't need to kind of take on that voice as your own to include them in your work. And I think even when including them in your work, you have to do the care and the research and the consideration as to why you're choosing to do so.
Yes, great answers. There's a couple of kind of specific questions for Samantha that I think would be really useful for writers to hear about. I'll put them together. Samantha, any thoughts on making a query letter stand out? And then, does no reply mean rejection? And how long should we wait before moving on?
So addressing the first question in terms of query letters, I know that query letters are very difficult. I applaud everyone who has ever attempted to make one. Like, you already are halfway there. In terms of making it break out, for me, I personally am really drawn to very clean query letters. You know, getting to, you know, listing the word count, listing the genre, listing why this particular story is important to you, and having it read almost like a back cover copy. I mean, in essence, your goal is to be published, so being able to kind of pack it in a way that's very concise but also very captivating is really helpful for an agent, because that's kind of our first taste of your writing. Being able to see that query and being captivated enough to continue on to the sample pages and reading that thoroughly, and really deciding that we're thinking of the full story when making our decision on whether or not to request or pass. In terms of no reply, I think every agency has their own different approach to that. So some agencies have it where they only reply to things that they're interested in. I personally reply to all of my queries, so it may take me some time, but I do make sure that you are informed of where I am on it. So if there's an agent that you've queried and you haven't heard back, I think that you can look into their website to see if they have specific instructions about that. Or I think following up in that case and saying, you know, it's been X amount of weeks, you know, and your website says that it takes this long to hear back. I just wanted to check in on the status of my submission. I think that's perfectly reasonable.
So that doesn't alienate an agent. I think some writers worry about, like, oh, we're nagging you and you'll get mad at us or something.
I think that like for me, I think mine says about like 4 to 6 weeks. So if someone nudges me like before then, I might be a little more like, I know it's coming, I promise, we're in a pandemic.
Yes.
But you know, if it's like been like 8-12 weeks and you're like, hey, what's going on, I think that's a reasonable you know, nudge. And I think every agency also has different time frames for when they reply, so keep that in mind as well.
Well, I can offer my perspective as a small press publisher too, because I mostly I get queries directly from authors rather than from agents. And so what I found, and maybe because it's a small publisher and a small press, and we probably don't have nearly as many submissions as an agent does and so forth. But I made a point to start reading the manuscript regardless of how off-putting the query letter might have been, or how, not necessarily off-putting, but just I realized that authors, creative writers, are usually really, really bad at describing their work in the best way possible. I don't know why. So, I come across, manuscripts I love, and I think, wow, they did not, now that I've read it, now that I read the book, the cover letter did not do justice to it, Yeah. But that's a shame then, because it means that a person's, let's say, marketing instincts are part of what is helping them get in the door. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I definitely read the sample pages because I know how query letters are difficult. It is the first taste, but I know I can usually, once you kind of get past that and you get to the sample pages, if they were I worked really hard on that query letter, I wasn't really sure what I was doing, but there's still great material there. I think I think most of us really are considerate of both approaches, but having a great query letter helps, because if I'm thinking about, okay, what editor am I going to pitch this to, or what scout am I going to talk to, and seeing if I can pull a sentence from that query, and then immediately I'm thinking of people that I would go out with, that's a really great indicator. But obviously it's a skill that's learned, and I think we don't want to keep people at a disadvantage as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Kirsten, did you want to chime in on that, or?
Well, I think.
Uh-oh.
It still looks good.
Wow, drama.
It's a little drama. Room? Yeah. Okay. I'm just waiting for my cat to walk behind me, so that'll just be perfect.
What was I saying? Okay.
Right.
So I think one of the important things that we need to keep in mind too is the technical ability. So I always am really pushing and reminding people that, this is a business, and your query letter is your introductory letter when you are applying for a job, right? So you are representing yourself professionally. And yes, it is really difficult to understand the marketing aspect and knowing how to present your work. I'm terrible at talking about my work. When I'm out meeting people and they're tell us about your book, I'm oh. And I just turn to the person next to me you tell them.
Yeah. Turn to me.
So
say ask Rosalie.
Yeah, it's a learned skill. But also just being really aware to present yourself professionally and industry standard, technically, on a technical level, your work should always be, as clean and clear and perfect as you can make it, so that you don't, that editors aren't getting distracted by spelling errors, or oh, this person didn't spell my name correctly, or these little tiny things that can signal how prepared you are for this job of being a writer.
Yeah, or kind of signal how you will be to work with.
Mm-hmm.
How the agent or editor might think about. I'm getting a couple of people are asking this, and it's a good question. Let's see if I can find. Okay, so a couple of people asked this, but here's one. Should you put that you are a person of color in your query letter? And somebody else was saying, and how do you do that? Which is interesting. Yes, should you mention you are a writer of color in the query letter, and if so, how? I think that's an excellent question.
I like when people kind of highlight, in the author bio, I actually really pay attention to that. It's really important to me that I have a sense of who's writing the story. Mm-hmm. So I think you can kind of quickly talk about your background. I like when people mention their marginalizations, because it can highlight, why they chose this particular story, why it's unique to them. I guess it could be kind of tricky, but you know, yeah, I've never really thought about how. I think maybe the third person is a safe way to go, like writing your author bio.
Mm-hmm.
So you say like blank author is a Black female author writing this genre, and etc. That makes sense.
I know that I put that in my bio, but especially because maybe, you know, Latinx doesn't cover the specificity in an interesting enough way for me. You know, I say, you know, I'm half Puerto Rican and half Pennsylvania Dutch, you know, which is pretty weird as it is. But for people who are maybe they feel weird about like putting it right in their bio, perhaps somewhere in the query letter you could also say, as a writer, as a Puerto Rican woman, or as a woman whose parents migrated from Jamaica, or as a disabled writer, I have found blah, 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 or, you know, as a blank, fill in the blank writer, I'm interested in, you could sort of put that in the query letter when you're giving information to the agent. So it's a little more of a, like a conversational style. You're letting them get to know you. You know, I think I definitely think it's good. I agree with you, Samantha, to identify that aspect of your identity in the cover letters.
Yeah, especially for identities that I don't connect with, it feels more personal and more like I can kind of glean why this story is important more when I understand the relationship to the author.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. Kirsten, did you want to weigh in on that, or?
No, I think you said everything. That's good. I agree.
Okay, that's nice. I'm trying to check the other questions, because we're getting a lot of them now. If you're a person of color and writing from a person of color perspective, how important is it to find an editor who is also a person of color? I could imagine there are instances where a white editor could do harm, and I mean, I think that has been the experience of a number of writers. But before turning that over to you, I'll just say that even just looking at the statistics that I talked about, you know, you're less likely, though, to find an editor of color. So you might want to just try finding other, or at least approaching other agents or other editors too, right? I mean, any thoughts on that?
I think, as you said, the market, it's kind of hard because of the proportions, I guess, are skewed. Yes. That's the word I was looking for. But I think that, again, I have to kind of speak from the agent perspective, where, you know, when you have a conversation with your client, you want to know what's important to them, right? So, like, what do you want, most importantly, when we're going out on submission with this particular project? Do we want to find an author or an editor of color? Do we want to make sure that this part of the story, no matter what revisions we do, doesn't change? And I think having those conversations kind of early on sets the stage for how the submission will go. But like, especially since the publishing industry is very relationship based, I think we're fortunate enough to kind of reach out to these people we're going on submission with and say, hey, I have this project. My client is a person of color and they're writing about this particular experience. And, you know, we understand revisions are going to happen, but this element is essential. Is this something that you think would work? Is this something that, you know, you would want to change? Because then this might not be the right fit, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
that's very useful.
Yeah, I think having those conversations are important, and it is a relationship-based business, so you can kind of suss that out fairly early on before hopefully it becomes an issue. But obviously in some cases it's unavoidable, or not unavoidable, but more tricky.
Mm-hmm.
That it is relationship based, I think I think has made that industry seem more inaccessible to me. You know, I think you know, should it really be based on, you know, who you know and what kind of rapport you've established with a particular editor. You know, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons. I think you're absolutely right, and I think that is one of the reasons, though, that some authors feel like this is, you know, this is going to be really hard, this process of being heard and so forth. I know we have only a few minutes left. I'm going to quickly read this question and maybe quickly give an answer, something that I thought about. There seems to be some gatekeeping in the industry where MFAs or publishing in prestigious literary journals seem to be passports before one can be considered by agents or publishers. These can be pretty elitist pursuits. And I guess that's not really a question, but I totally agree with, and that sort of relates to what I was saying about the inaccessibility. And this is the kind of thing where I wish we had more time, because certainly there are, it makes me think about the National Book Critics Circle award procedure, which is really based, it's the most interesting process I've seen, and not very accessible, I think. There's not enough time to talk about that, but that's yet another thing I wanted to talk about here. But yeah, there's gatekeeping everywhere. MFA programs, literary journals, each person who has some kind of influence is a gatekeeper. And I hope that will make people think, especially, let's say, straight white writers who maybe have founded literary journals, or they're on awards panels or whatever, they'll think some more about, wow, what am I doing as a gatekeeper? Am I closing the gate? You know, is there more I could do, and more questions I could ask, instead of just being happy with the status quo. I know I'm not going to name the journal, but just recently there was a small online journal that said they had been publishing for 20 years, and they had never published a Black author. So yeah, my eyebrows did that too. And and I had so many questions. But the first, I mean, even assuming, like, how do they know? But secondly, how is that even possible? And yet it is. And I'm glad that the person at least thought about that and admitted it, said, wow, you know. But hopefully people will ask themselves that. If they truly want to be white allies, white people will be asking themselves that. In whatever capacity they have as gatekeepers. Did anyone, should we just wrap this up? Kirsten, was there something else you wanted to add? That I know that Samantha and I have been talking a lot. Is there something you wanted to?
Well, I think in relation to that question about the literary magazines, we're at such a tremendous time in publishing when there are so many small and independent presses. There's so many amazing magazines that you don't necessarily have to go down that familiar path anymore. You know, that is not the only way to succeed. And I think that being able to be published by a magazine or a literary journal or a publishing house that respects and appreciates your work will go a lot further toward your ability to keep producing quality work and keep loving what you do than being published in a name magazine just to, you know, accrue those laurels. I mean, if you're in it for the long term, the goal is to develop yourself as an artist and have a voice in the conversation. And to do that, you have to take care of yourself, and you take care of yourself by participating in a world that, you know, in a publishing sphere where you can be heard and your voice does matter. And then, you know, you will have the strength and support to have said, yes, I have all these publishing credentials and I'm moving forward. And you do that professionally.
Great. No, that's very well put. And since I see it's 2 o'clock, I need to wrap this up. So thank you to everyone who's participated and sending questions, and thank you to our panelists and Gotham Writers Workshop for setting this up. And I know that we are going to, the Gotham Writers Workshop is going to have this available online later and on YouTube, so you can tell other people in case they missed it. And again, thank you.
Thank you both so much. Thank you, Samantha.
Thank you.
And thank you,
It was such a
Rosalie.
pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.